And joining us now, AgriGold agronomist in Illinois, Nick Frederking is with us. Nick, good to catch up with you, sir. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good, Jesse. Nice to be here. How are you?
I am good. I am good. I appreciate the time. Let's jump right in and talk a little bit. Looking at soybeans, we're trying to get to the finish line across the country in beans and looking at disease pressures this year. We always keep hearing about SDS in soybeans and how much yield that can rob. But SDS is also, comparable to some other diseases that you can maybe mistake a different disease for SDS in your bean fields. So explain this to me a little bit. What are some of your thoughts behind this and what growers need to be watching out for, Nick?
Yeah, so in corn this year, we've had very low disease pressure, but in soybeans, in the last month, we've started to see those foliar symptoms pop up in the canopy that would normally resemble sudden death syndrome in soybeans, or SDS for short. Now, the problem is there's some imposter diseases, right? We've got sudden death syndrome, obviously, but then brown stem rot, stem canker, and now a new one, red crown rot. All four of these can show those same foliar symptoms of interveinal chlorosis, some necrosis, and the challenge is diagnosing which one we're dealing with because there are different ways to manage those pathogens.
Okay, so talk to me about managing some of those pathogens. Say I go out into my field and I don't find SDS, but I find one of those other diseases you mentioned. What are some late season management tips that I could maybe consider, or is this something where I have to think about next year's crop, Nick?
Great question. You're not doing anything about it this year if you see the foliar symptoms. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that's just the way these diseases work. So, all four that I've just described, SDS, brown stem rot, stem canker, and then red crown rot, are all infecting early in that season. And all starting either a root decay or some kind of stem and plant decay early on. Those foliar symptoms that we're seeing are just a byproduct of that early infection. There's those toxins that get metabolized up through the canopy, through those leaves, and that's where those symptoms are expressed. So foliar fungicides, not going to control these toxins, not going to control these diseases because the problem started shortly after planting and the damage has just continued to happen all season long. Now, we may make pods on these plants that have been affected. The plants may look fine the majority of the year. But, in the last month or so, we've started to see a lot of premature death in these soybeans. So I'm seeing some plants that have, let's say they put on 40 pods. Those plants today have no seeds to give because they just died too soon. They couldn't fill out those beans. And, in some areas, we may see 25 or 30% yield loss, possibly more in severely infected fields. Yeah, there's just no way to handle that late season. It has to
Mhm.
happen early season with either seed treatments, variety selection in our soybeans, or just cultural practices as far as tillage of residue, crop rotation, and going to non-host crops.
Well, yeah, and I think piggybacking off of that, yeah, obviously not being able to do anything here late season, but looking towards next year, I think with harvest one, maybe prioritizing which field you're going to go into first, because if you have a field that has been hit with this disease, probably just going to let it go, leave it till last. But then also making that plan this winter into next year as we start to see what spring planting conditions are like, and having that plan in place before you hit the field, right, Nick?
100%. Absolutely. Yep. So, I want to make sure we highlight, though, as we go and assess these fields, whether it's at harvest or prior to harvest, making sure we understand which disease we're looking at. So, if I could
Mhm.
briefly go through how I diagnose in the field, the differentiation between these diseases, I'd love to do that if that's okay with you, Jesse.
Yeah, please do. Please do. I'd love to learn more.
Yeah, so I walk out to these fields often and guys say, "Man, I had SDS this year." I'm like, "Hold the phone. Let's make sure it is SDS." So the first thing I'll do is find those plants that are expressing interveinal chlorosis, those foliar symptoms that we're accustomed to. I pull those out of the field, and now I have to go through a series of questions with those four diseases that we just talked about. The first one's going to be stem canker because of the four, that's the only one we're going to notice exterior symptoms on the outside of the plant. So in stem canker, we're going to notice little lesions climbing from the bottom of the stem up the plant at every node level. That would be stem canker. I evaluate the plants. I don't see that. Now I can move to the interior of that plant. So I'll often split that stem of that soybean plant and start examining those inner tissues. It would be the pith tissue. I think everybody's probably split a corn plant before. They've seen that inside stalk. No different. That white pithy tissue should be inside of that soybean plant. If it is not white and we got some decay moving up from the crown up to that plant, we may have brown stem rot. Brown stem rot is going to have that dark decayed pith tissue as we look inside of that stem. Let's say it's not brown or decayed. It's still white. Well, now I can rule out stem canker and I can rule out brown stem rot. Push those to the side. Now we're dealing with SDS and red crown rot that would show those symptoms. SDS is going to keep a white interior of that pith. It's going to continue to look fairly healthy, but there will be some obvious root decay and crown decay in that plant. We can sometimes notice some bluish green fungus growing around that tap root where that fungus actually infected and decayed that root system. That would be SDS. The differentiator for red crown rot, which is a relatively new pathogen to the area, would be a distinct red tinge right at the soil line of where that soybean plant is coming out of the ground. And then the distinguishing factor would be these tiny red spores that separate red crown rot from any of the other three diseases that we're talking about. And that's really important because we have some active ingredients today that can combat SDS, right? There's really only two on the market today. It'd be Saltro and Levo. Those would be the two that combat that. But aside from that, brown stem rot, stem canker, and red crown rot, to my knowledge today, we don't have active ingredients that would combat those specific pathogens. That would be more variety selection and cultivar selection for genetic resistance. My thought today, and I think it's shared a little bit throughout the industry, is that sudden death syndrome may be our leading factor in infection in these plants, and some of these others piggyback their way into the plant once that initial decay has happened right there at the root and crown. So those are my thoughts when we talk about differentiating diseases, but that's why it's so important to assess which one is actually affecting our soybeans in the field.
Well, fantastic analysis. And I think that's great for growers to definitely keep that in mind as they're looking at fields here this fall in their soybeans. Nick, any other thoughts you want to share with us just as we're preparing for, this fall and getting into next year and thinking about all these different diseases we got to watch out for in soybeans? Anything else you want to mention today?
Well, record keeping is the name of the game. We certainly want to identify which fields have a history of these diseases. So in more severe cases, we can manage accordingly, right? If we're seeing fields that have high incidence of SDS or stem canker or brown stem rot, even red crown rot, well, they all like infection early in those cooler, very wet soils because they're fungal pathogens. Should we have a field history of this? We need to know that variety selection is important. And maybe we need to push that planting date back a little bit into that, warmer soil conditions where we're not such a threat of getting this infection. And that's kind of contrary to what the industry says today, right? Because yield in soybeans is like a given if we plant early. But if we lose 25 to 30% of this yield because we've got that infection from early planting, did we gain anything? I would argue that.
Very, very true. Well, and I know as well, if growers need some advice, they need some help, they could reach out to their local AgriGold agronomist, such as yourself. And I'm sure they could start, if they don't know who that is, go online, agrigold.com, or contact their local retailer, can't they?
Absolutely. You got agrigold.com to find your local agronomist. There's always a local DSM team very close by. So, yep, that's great advice.
Fantastic. Well, Nick Frederking with AgriGold, appreciate a few minutes of your time. I should ask real quick before I let you go. I know you cover a lot of Southern Illinois. How's crops looking as we near harvest there overall?
Yeah, overall, there's a lot of variability out there. Southern Illinois is not a one-trick pony. There are a lot of environments here. So I do cover the bottom half of the state. I get up into that dark soil. I've got the sands on both rivers, and I've got that marginal silt loam that can challenge some guys in the center. So we're going to see guys with above average yields. We're going to see guys that are significantly below average. And then we'll have, a lot of stuff that's just kind of on par in that 180 to 220 bushel range. But overall, I love the environment we've got right now. Some cooler temperatures at night, really allowing that pericarp of the corn to stretch and pack some dry matter inside. Soybean stress is alleviated a little bit with some recent rains and these cooler temperatures. So I like the way we're finishing, much more favorable than we looked early on in the season.
Fantastic. Well, again, we appreciate the time with that. Nick Frederking with AgriGold. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll hopefully get a chance to talk to you again real soon.
I really appreciate the time, Jesse.